Hey guys, it's Mrs. Wallace. Hope you guys are doing okay. Everybody's holding up. I just wanted to give you a little bit of an introduction to oligopoly. So this video is all about oligopoly. This is the fourth of the markets that we're going to be working with. So if you think about oligopoly, it is not going to be as competitive as monopolistic competition. So there won't be ease of entry with firms entering and exiting, but it's not quite like monopoly either. The best way to describe an oligopoly is that there's usually a few firms that heavily dominate an industry, or there's just a few firms, right? It's just limited to 2 or 3 or 4 really large firms. So if we look at oligopoly, remember that we have this spectrum of different markets, and everything but perfect competition is imperfect and has a demand curve that is downward sloping. So it's really only perfect competition where you have all those competitors and perfectly elastic demand. This is the model that's productively and allocatively efficient. We did the side-by-side graphing with this. We also spent a little bit of time with monopoly, where we looked at what happens when the firm is the market. So, in this case, the marginal revenue is less than the demand curve. And then there's also the market for monopolistic competition. You guys did your Shark Tank activity with that. That was kind of neat. So the idea here is that there's so many firms, but each firm is kind of competing for with a differentiated product, and they're looking to carve out some of the market share. So if I'm entering into an industry and you happen to be competing already in that industry, my entry in might actually lower the demand for your product. In oligopoly, we are actually looking at something that's got a lot of things in common with monopoly. In fact, oligopolies can sometimes behave like monopoly. We might get a few firms in an oligopoly that might collude and essentially graph like a monopoly and kind of follow that model. We also have some elements of monopolistic competition, and sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between an oligopoly and an industry that is monopolistically competitive. Okay, so let's look at some of the features of oligopoly, and we'll look at how we might know the difference between those two markets. So one characteristic of oligopoly is that there's a few large producers. You could have an example where you have a duopoly, where there's two large firms and only two large firms. So that's an example of an oligopoly. But you could also have a market where there's maybe 20 or 30 firms, where maybe 4 or 5 of the firms have most of the market share. Maybe 70% of all the revenue is earned by 4 firms. So in that case, you're looking at a few large producers, even though there might be several competitors in the industry. You might also have identical or differentiated products. Okay, you see both. So for example, oil might be something that's a product that's homogeneous, and we might classify that as an oligopoly. We might also see something like cars in the US, right? GM and Ford are two very large car producers, and they are producing, cars, but they're differentiated, right? There's high barriers to entry in an oligopoly, so there is not an ease of entry, but there may be some entry, but largely high barriers to entry. There's some control over price, so like monopoly, they're price makers. The really key feature of an oligopoly is that firms are generally strategic. They have an interdependence, okay? What might that mean? Well, if I'm one of 2 or 3 very, very large firms, say that I'm GM, and I'm deciding whether I'm going to advertise my new car that's coming out in October, and Ford is also, maybe I'm thinking, going to also advertise. My decision whether to advertise and invest a lot of money in advertising might be dependent on whether I think my major competitor, Ford, is going to be advertising at the same time. If we're both going to be advertising, we might kind of cancel each other out. So I might wait to advertise when I know that they're not going to advertise, because my ability to make money when I advertise and they don't might be a higher payoff, so to speak, than if I advertise and the other firm also advertises. So we want to know what's going to happen. If we do something, what will the other firm do? And if we know what the other firm is going to do, how is that going to affect the decision that we make? That's kind of the interdependence. So in order to understand this type of interdependence, we'll be looking at game theory, okay? An example of an interesting oligopoly, of course, is the organization of OPEC. We kind of see this in action, lately, because we know that Saudi Arabia, Russia, there's been a variety of different activities going on with oil prices and with the quantity of oil that's being produced, and some of these decisions are occurring with OPEC, which is a group of oil-producing countries. Not every country that produces oil is necessarily in OPEC, but OPEC operates as an oligopoly that is essentially a cartel. They collude, but because it's not U.S., it's illegal to collude in the United States, but because it is not a U.S.-based entity, it's a little different, okay? Okay, so a couple of other things that are definitional, and this is, useful, right? Oligopolies occur when a few large firms are generally starting to control an industry, okay? So, for example, maybe your cell phones, maybe there is a oligopoly of sorts if firms actually start to create some successful mergers. You can actually end up with an oligopoly if there is a merger, and sometimes for antitrust purposes, we're looking at the federal government sometimes to stop mergers so that we don't have oligopoly behavior. And high barriers to entry are generally in place so that other firms can't enter. If we're talking about a barrier to entry, there's a variety of some, and they're a little bit different than monopoly. Remember, monopolies have complete barriers to entry. One example of a barrier to entry for oligopoly would be economies of scale. Some firms, because they have a really high amount of, the scale of GM, right, is massive. It already has plants all over the country, all over the world. It is able to produce a great amount of cars, with robotic technology, and there's a whole kind of assembly line in place. They are making cars at a very low cost. If I was trying to get into that industry, it would require me to have some similar scale to be able to compete. And I can't. So, similar to the example of monopoly, economies of scale can be a barrier to entry. There's also the concept of high startup costs. Okay, this is essentially the idea that you might have a great deal of high startup costs and ownership of raw materials. Okay, so similar to monopoly, these are examples of types of barriers to entry. Okay, I know this slide is kind of funky, but this really relates to how do we know if an industry is a monopolistic competition type of industry or if it's going to be an oligopoly. And this is sometimes a fine line, right? We could say, okay, we know that some companies that show up in the mall, like Abercrombie or some Urban Outfitters or something like that, likely monopolistic competition. They're producing a differentiated product, and we know that they're kind of competing for the same consumers, literally in the same section of the mall. And that's maybe clear-cut monopolistic competition. We know that there are also smaller firms. There's a great deal of competition in that market and whatnot. However, if we took another market, like maybe we're interested in, say, office supplies, and we know, well, there's Staples, there's maybe some other firms that are kind of like that, and then there's a few like mom and pop local, Ridgewood Office Supply Company or something like that. Is this industry an oligopoly or monopolistic competition? Economists have come up with a few different measurements. So the basic one is known as a concentration ratio. Okay, very straightforward. Imagine that there's 4 firms, okay, firm 1, firm 2, firm 3, and firm 4. And each one of these firms is kind of capturing a certain percentage of the market. Okay, they're capturing a certain percentage of the revenue. 25%, 10%, 10%, 5%. Okay, if we were to actually tally up the concentration ratio for these 4 firms, and it's possible there could even be 8 firms or 10 firms in the market, but if we just took the 4 largest firms, what's the 4 firm concentration ratio? if we have a four-firm concentration ratio, so this would be an example of 50, a concentration ratio of 50. First firm has 25% of the market. The fourth largest firm has 5% of the market. We've got some 10% here. This would be a concentration ratio of a 60, we'd say, yeah, that's pretty much oligopoly behavior, right? But there is a limitation with the concentration ratio, right? What if we had a market of four businesses and one firm had 50% of the market, the second firm had 48% of the market, and then these two firms, okay, had like 1 and a 1, right? This would be 100% of the market, but this is kind of weird because the first two firms have most of the market, and these two other firms are quite small. If we had a second industry that was 25%, 25%, 25, and 25, they both kind of show these four firms have 100% of the market, but clearly these are not the same markets, right? They're very different types of markets because one is dominated by two players and one is dominated by four. So economists have created something known as the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, otherwise known as the HHI, and this just kind of weights some of the market shares so that we have a sense that the bigger market shares are just going to count more in the like numeric assessment. So the way that this would work, you also take the four largest firms, or you could really do, in the HHI index, you could do every firm in a market. Could be 40 firms in a market, and you could do an HHI on every single one of those. So let's say that there were four firms in this market. 30, 30, 20, and 20%, okay? What we would do is we would square each of these. 30 squared plus 30 squared plus 20 squared plus 20 squared, and we would get a number of 2,600. If we had a monopoly and we were trying to do an HHI, you would have 100%, one firm has 100% of the market, and that would be 100 squared. The greatest HHI that you could have would be 10,000. Okay, if you had two firms, with 50% of the market each, 50 squared plus 50 squared. So you can kind of see, how the kind of number on a scale from, say, whatever, something very small to 10,000, you could end up with a number that gives us an idea of how concentrated the industry is. Anything greater than 2,500 is often considered highly concentrated. It's not technically definition for an oligopoly, but if this was a court case and we were looking at issues of antitrust, if we were, the DOJ and we were trying to prevent a merger from happening, we might consider the HHI index, okay, or the HHI. Okay, so there's a few different types of models for oligopoly. Unlike monopoly or perfect competition, oligopolies don't always graph the same. Their behavior can be dependent on the circumstances. So in other words, oligopolies can collude and they can operate like a monopoly, or they can act strategically to compete against each other. When they do that, we're going to be very interested in game theory, right? How is it that I can figure out if I happen to be GM and I want to advertise, how do I know what Ford is doing? That type of thinking is something that we'll spend a little bit of time in. Game theory is really the study of how interdependent decision makers make choices, and game theory is probably something you're familiar with. It's something that you do in a variety of ways, right? Whether you're playing like tic-tac-toe or chess, or you're really into thinking about cooperative games, trying to get people to all move on a certain action at the same time. There's a great deal of complex games. And of course, game theory is instrumental in a lot of different fields, heavily used in economics, but also international relations. If you've ever studied the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy and Khrushchev trying to decide what to do, and if we do this, then they might do this, and then if we think they're going to do this, then we should do this. So lots and lots of foreign affairs and international relations, political science, contract labor disputes. Even if you're going to buy a car, sometimes you are engaging in game theory. This does help oligopolies make strategic decisions and maximize profit. So we'll look at some examples of this. Okay, so here we have what is a typical situation for a very simple game that we're going to be involved in. And we're looking at payoffs and a payoff matrix. And we're going to be doing this with a duopoly model, assuming we have two firms. We have Bob's Cafe and we have Susie's Cafe. Both of these are firms that serve breakfast, okay? And everything related to Bob is in blue, everything related to Susie is in red, okay? Each one of these firms has a choice. They can introduce a new breakfast sandwich this week, come up with something that's a totally new menu item, or they can not introduce a new breakfast sandwich. And they are generally two firms that are across the street from each other, and they are in an oligopoly, okay? Bob can make a choice. He can either intro the sandwich or not intro the sandwich, but he's interested in what Susie might do. If Susie is introducing the sandwich, okay, then Bob has two possible choices. If Susie intros, I'm only interested in looking at this section of the payoff matrix, okay? This payoff matrix indicates how much revenue Bob or Susie will get depending on the decision that they make. So if Susie introduces the breakfast sandwich and Bob also introduces the breakfast sandwich, okay, then Bob is set to get $1,600. And I've indicated that by putting Bob in blue and underlining, okay? So if Bob introduces, he gets $1,600. If Susie introduces, but Bob doesn't introduce, okay, then Bob gets $1,000. So Bob has a choice. If he knows ahead of time that Susie's going to introduce that breakfast sandwich come Monday morning, he can either introduce and get $1,600 or not introduce and get $1,000. Okay, so clearly Bob is going to introduce and he is going to pick introduce. If we know that Susie is not going to introduce, okay, so we decide Susie is not going to introduce, and Bob has to either introduce or not introduce, and Susie is now not going to introduce. So we're deciding Bob has two choices. He can either introduce for $2,400 or not introduce for $2,100. Okay, everything that's blue is Bob, everything that's red is Susie. This kind of two squares here are suggesting that Susie is not introducing. Okay, what are the payoffs if there's no introducing? Well, Bob is either introducing for $2,400 or not introducing for $2,100. Which one is the higher payoff matrix? It's going to be $2,400, okay? So in both cases, regardless of what Susie does, whether she introduces the sandwich or doesn't introduce the sandwich, Bob should introduce, okay? That's always the best decision for him. It doesn't matter what Susie does. We're going to suggest that Bob has a dominant strategy, okay? We know it doesn't matter what Susie does. Bob should actually play his dominant strategy. He should introduce the breakfast sandwich, okay? Now we can look at things from Susie's perspective, okay? So if we look at some things from Susie's perspective, and I'm just going to take that away a little bit. If we look at things from Susie's perspective, okay, and remember, Bob had a dominant strategy. That dominant strategy was to intro, okay, so we can kind of circle intro for Bob. If we look at Susie, okay, Susie is now, she's going to assume Bob is either going to intro or not intro. So for Susie, she gets to either introduce, so we're looking at these are Susie's payoffs. So if Bob introduces, Susie is either going to introduce, right, or not introduce. Sorry, I got to make sure if Bob introduces, okay, so here's Bob introducing. If Bob introduces, Susie's choosing between intro at $1,700 or not intro at $1,400, okay? So Susie should definitely intro. If Bob decides not to intro, and Susie knows that Bob's not going to introduce that breakfast sandwich, Susie can either introduce for $3,000, okay, or not introduce for $2,000. So she should definitely introduce, okay? Like Bob, Susie has a dominant strategy. It doesn't matter what Bob does. Susie is always better off introducing the breakfast sandwich, okay? So she will always get the higher payoff if she introduces. Now, clearly, if these two decide on Monday morning to play this game, okay, and they all know the payoff matrix, they are playing a one-time simultaneous game, so they're both going to decide on Monday morning whether to make that breakfast sandwich or not. We're going to see exactly where they're going to end up, okay? They're going to end up here with this particular set of payoffs because they're both going to intro and intro. They both go ahead and introduce the breakfast sandwich. and Bob will get $1,600 and Susie will get $1,700. Okay, that square right here ends up being where both players have played their dominant strategy. Okay, guys, last slide. And this really fits something that you're probably familiar with, and hopefully this will make the game theory thing a little bit more kind of connected to what you already know, and that's the prisoner's dilemma. It's kind of a classic issue, and a lot of game theory problems end up looking an awful lot like prisoner's dilemma. So it's like a good one for us to start with. And kind of keep in mind that whenever we're doing game theory, we're always going to be looking at a payoff matrix. Okay, so the payoff matrix is this box that tells us what the payoffs will be for each player playing the game. And a game is always going to be comprised of players. Okay, it doesn't have to be just two. We often will be looking at two, but you could have 10. You could have any number of players. We also will have players that have strategies. Okay, so they will ultimately be playing strategies, and based on that, we will also have the payoff matrix. Okay, so there is a series of payoffs that we're looking at, and we're assuming some things that in this case we can work with this because both players are going to be aware of each other's payoffs and will be familiar with the payoff matrix. In some cases, the harder part of games theory is coming up with the numbers inside the payoff matrix. It's not easy to necessarily do that. But this is going to be a classic game where we have Tom and we have Jerry, okay? And let's just kind of underline Jerry's payoffs here. And unlike the last game where we had the payoffs measured in revenue dollars, in this case with the prisoner's dilemma, we're looking at a situation between two prisoners, okay? And let's kind of imagine that Tom is kind of in blue and his payoffs are going to be the first. We always take the player that's on the left and we kind of assume that their payoffs are on the left. You see the payoffs here separated by commas, so each box has one payoff for Tom, the payoff on the left, and one payoff for Jerry, the payoff on the right. There's 4 boxes because it represents 4 different combinations of decisions, that each player each player is making a decision between two things, but we ultimately have 4 possible kind of squares that they could land on. If we look at this is the prisoner's dilemma, it's set up with a particular story. Okay, we have Tom, we have Jerry, both of them are prisoners. Okay, basically this is a situation where these two prisoners are held in separate cells for a serious crime that they definitely committed. The prosecutor has only enough hard evidence to convict them of a minor offense, for which the penalty is a year. Each prisoner is told that if one confesses, to the major crime, while the other one remains silent, the confessor will go scot-free, and the other one is going to spend 10 years in prison. If both end up confessing, they will get an intermediate sentence of 5 years, okay? So, if neither confesses, they're only going to get 1 year because they're going to be, essentially just charged for the minor crime. If both confess, they're going to get 5 years. However, if Tom confesses and Jerry doesn't confess, then Tom is going to get 0 years and Jerry's going to get 10. If Tom doesn't confess and Jerry does confess, then Jerry is going to get 0 years and Tom is going to get 10. So in order to figure out what Tom and Jerry should do, they're definitely going to consider, Tom's going to make his decision based on what he thinks Jerry's going to do, and Jerry's going to make his decision based on what he thinks Tom is going to do, okay? So let's look at kind of the payoff matrix and kind of go about this the same way every time. A lot of you will want to do this in your head, and in time you can, but for now, just kind of follow along with the basic idea because it can be a little bit arduous to read some of these payoff matrices, okay? So if you're Tom, so let's kind of play with Tom first, okay? He is going to decide what he should do. If we know Jerry is going to confess, okay? If Tom knows Jerry's definitely going to confess, Tom can make a choice. He can either confess and get 5 years in jail or not confess and get 10 years of jail. Okay, well, clearly he should confess. Okay, this is the better choice, 5 years. In this case, the numbers that are lower are better because we're talking years in jail. If Jerry doesn't confess, okay, so now we're looking kind of at this side here. If Jerry doesn't confess, what should Tom do? Should he confess and get 0 years in jail, or not confess and get 1 year in jail? Well, clearly he should not confess, and he should confess and he would get 0 years in jail. So whether Jerry confesses or doesn't confess, Tom should definitely confess, okay? Does Tom have a dominant strategy? Yes. It doesn't matter what Jerry does. Tom is always better off confessing, okay? So let's assume that Tom is a dominant strategy and he is going to confess. If we kind of do the same thing with Jerry, okay, let's kind of clean this up because I really am making a mess. I got to get better at this, guys. If we look at things from Jerry's perspective, okay, we'll just kind of use this bouncing dot. I think it probably cleans up things a little bit better. If we assume that Jerry's going to decide whether to confess or to not confess. And remember, Jerry's got the yellow payoffs. So if he knows that Tom is going to confess, what should Jerry do? Get 5 years in prison if he confesses, 10 years in prison if he doesn't confess. Survey says, he should confess, okay? So he should confess, and he is going to be here, okay? At the same time, if he knows Tom is not going to confess, he can either get 1 year or 0 years, right? He can either not confess or confess. He's better off confessing. Regardless of what Tom decides to do, Jerry's always better off confessing, okay? If that's the case, and Jerry is always better off confessing, he also has a dominant strategy, okay? If both players have a dominant strategy, notice what happens. If they go to play this game, simultaneous, one-time game, and they're not communicating, okay? We're assuming that Tom and Jerry are in two different cells, and they're not able to talk to each other. If they weigh their payoffs, okay, what is it that they're going to decide to do? They're definitely going to decide to confess. Both of them will confess, and this is what will happen. Each of them will get 5 years in prison. What is significant about the situation of a prisoner's dilemma? One, both players have a dominant strategy. Notice Tom had a dominant strategy, Jerry had a dominant strategy. They both went for confess, regardless of what the other player did. And by doing that, they also ended off at a payoff matrix that's not the most optimal on the board. If we wanted to ask what would be the most optimal, it would be this one. If they could pick together and they could collude and they could talk to each other, and they sit and said, okay, what would be the best thing we could do? They would probably agree that not confessing and not confessing would be the best option, right? That is the dilemma. By playing this game and ensuring that they both aren't going to end up with the worst option, they end up with a mediocre option that is not Pareto optimal, okay? At the same time, we do have a significant title for this square that's right here. Not only is it the place where both players are playing their they're playing their dominant strategy. This is optimal. This is where they are playing their dominant strategies. We're going to call this the Nash equilibrium, okay, which we'll spend some more time on, but I'm just going to throw it out there. It's named after John Nash. If you've ever seen Beautiful Mind or read the book Beautiful Mind, if you haven't, watch it over break. It's amazing. He actually died in a car accident some years ago on the Jersey Turnpike, but an incredible mathematician. In any case, the Nash equilibrium it's different than a dominant strategy, and you can have a Nash equilibrium even without dominant strategies. But if you have two players that have dominant strategies, you definitely have a Nash equilibrium. And in this case, we know we're at a Nash equilibrium because neither player has an incentive to move off of that off of that square. Tom, he's confessing, he's getting 5 years. He has no incentive to not confess and get 10 years. The same thing with Jerry. He's getting 5 years in jail. He has no incentive to move to his other choice, which is 10. So they're sitting at a Nash equilibrium, but the Nash equilibrium is not Pareto optimal. Okie doke, have a good rest of the afternoon. I'm going to give you 2 practice problems, and your task is to find out what the if there's a dominant strategy and what the Nash equilibrium would be in each of the 2 examples that I give you.